All right, so today we are going to look at George Kateb's book on human dignity. But first, I wanted to get through just a couple of points that Kant makes in the metaphysical elements of justice. I didn't want to give this to you to read because how much Kant can I reasonably expect you to read within a single course? But there are some points here that I think give a little bit more flesh to the idea of justice that he has in mind as that pertains to human rights later. And I think that we'll see some of these principles coming up, not just where we've looked before in the Declaration of Human Rights, but also in some of the things that Kateb discusses. So Kant acknowledges then that laws can be unjust. This is an important point because all of his emphasis on duty then is directed not at specific codes of laws, but rather at the universal law, right? Captured by the categorical imperative. Now, the trick, though, is that he thinks that we can't simply assess the justness of laws empirically. So we can't just look and see at what the effects of laws are, and then work out if they're just or unjust. But, as he kind of says in the Metaphysics, we need actually to look at laws through the lens of reason and assess them that way. Assess how closely a law then comes to the idea of universal law, or the application of the categorical imperative, in other words. And so this articulates importantly with his idea of justice. As we'll see with Kateb later on, there's an interesting distinction that he makes between morality and kind of existential status of humans that to some extent goes back to an idea of the empirical assessment of particular acts. And that will seem to be possibly a little bit at odds with what Kant has said, as much as he's indebted to Kant. But okay, so let's first of all, though, get clear on just what it is that Kant has to say. He thinks that the moral concept of justice, so justice that has a corresponding obligation, right? Because for him, morality is organized around the idea of an ought. You ought to do this or that, rather than the hypothetical imperative, which is if you want to achieve this end, you should do this other thing. So justice then organized around the idea of an obligation, an ought. He thinks that this applies in three ways. First, in relations between individuals whose actions influence one another. Secondly, only to the relationship of one person's will to another's. So not to desires and wishes, but to will. And again, you'll remember that one of the things that he wants to drive at is the idea that if we act under the sway of our desires, our inclinations, rather than our will, then our will is heteronymous. It's not acting freely, it's not acting autonomously, but rather it is acting under the power or under the influence of some other principle. So the same applies here. In other words, between people, what he would perhaps say is intersubjective. And then third, without considering the content or end of the will, but only the form. So again, pushing back against the utilitarian orientation to assessing an act based on its consequences, based on its outcomes. And so Kant again returns to the idea that it's a question of the form of the will rather than the outcome of willing in such a way that is the sort of the location of justice. So he thinks that you can capture this in 3 steps. First, justice is the entirety of conditions in which the will of one person can be connected to the will of another under a universal law of freedom. So again, if we were talking about desires in relationship to other desires, you would say that that's not the condition of the universal law of freedom. Why? Because, again, it all comes back to the quality of will. What defines the good will is what's at stake in terms of justice. Secondly, then, just actions in and of themselves or in their maxims, so in the subjective principles that organize them, allow the freedom of the will of each person to coexist with the freedom of everyone else's will under a universal law. Again, so then there's an important aspect of the will in a social context here, that justice has to do with the way that wills relate to one another. And this brings us to the third step. Thus, the universal law of justice is: act such that the free use of your will is compatible with the freedom of everyone else according to a universal law. Now, this is going to sound, not coincidentally, a lot like the categorical imperative. The principle then is that you can act in any way that you want, insofar as your actions and your will don't impose upon the freedom of anyone else's will. He thinks then that this is going to be coherent, that everyone can do this and get along, justly, that is, because he, again, has the idea that with the universal law, you have the application of reason to a self-legislating will, and that that is the condition of freedom then, right, is to be a self-legislating will that wills according to the categorical imperative. And so he thinks that when everybody's operating under those conditions, you don't have competing notions of justice or what one ought to do, but rather that people's wills will align with one another. And then it's simply a matter of organizing action in accordance with that will. As long as your action remains in accordance with that will, you won't interfere with anybody else's freedom, and therefore you can have a just world or a just community. So then the corollary of this, what goes along with this, is that anyone who hinders him from acting in a way that accords with the universal law does him an injustice. You could flip this around a little bit to say that anybody who interferes with my freedom as a self-legislating will behaves unjustly towards me. Why? Because I'm no longer free to act according to the universal law, and that is unjust. So that's sort of the reverse way of putting what we just saw. So his or my or your rights impose a duty on others, and vice versa, not to impede free action that accords with a universal law. So again, we saw this in the groundwork of the metaphysics as well, that the idea of duty here in relation to rights is not something that I have to meet in order to attain rights, as if first you do the duty, then you get the rights, but rather that my rights impose a duty on others and others' rights impose a duty on me. That is, not to interfere with one another's rights, with one another's freedom. In other words, not to act unjustly. So my duty to behave justly comes from other people's rights, and my rights impose on others the duty to act justly. And In this way, then, he thinks that reason and justice are consistent with coercion, because you can use coercion against injustice. He says, thus, right or justice and entitlement to use coercion mean the same thing. So coercion used in the defense of justice is itself just. So then, the right to what, fundamentally? Well, freedom. So freedom, or independence from the constraint of another person's will, because again, that would be heteronymous rather than autonomous willing. So freedom, independence from the constraint of another's will, insofar as this freedom is compatible with the freedom of everyone else, in accordance with a universal law, is the one sole and original right belonging to every person by virtue of his humanity, or, of course, her humanity. Now, we'll see when we get to Mill that this is going to sound surprisingly like something that Mill says, in spite of the fact that Mill is himself a utilitarian, one of the great, if not the great, utilitarian thinkers. But we'll get to that when we get to that. We've got some other fish to fry first. And so within this, we also get Kant's view of equality. Equality is independence from being bound by others to do more than one can also reciprocally bind them to do. So that I cannot demand of others anything more than they can bind me to do as well, right? That if my expectation is that they should have some obligations beyond those obligations that I have, then this is not, in his view, justice. This is not, in his view, the equality that corresponds with freedom, that corresponds with justice. So again, we see that justice or rights do not impose a duty on me to claim them, but that my rights place a duty on others and theirs on me. And that, I think, is the notion of equality that you find in the preamble and in the opening articles of the Declaration. Okay, so now on to human dignity. Now again, like Kant, Kateb thinks that we have human rights because we have human dignity, or because of human dignity, we have human rights. So in answering the question of why we should appeal to dignity to ground rights, he recognizes that there are arguments to ground them in other things. He points out that in the large volume of work defending rights, there's very little mention of dignity, except that is in Kant's philosophy, of course. So he thinks that the implications of dignity are worth consideration at both the species level and at the level of the individual human being. Human dignity, then, rests on the idea that humanity is the greatest type of being on earth, and so all humans deserve treatment commensurate with that greatness. So this is a very bold claim. He doesn't make the case that different species have their own kind of dignity, or different species have their own attributes that make them great in their own ways. No, he's staking his claim on the idea that humans are distinctive among all species, that there are no other species like humans, and that is due to a certain kind of human greatness. And because of that, humans are entitled to human rights in a way that no other species is entitled to the same kinds of rights, which is not the same as saying that you can do just whatever you like with other species. He's not there, but he does conceive of human rights as pertaining specifically to humans because of this human greatness. He knows that there are objections to this view. So human dignity does not provide an essential foundation for human rights. That's That's one view. He's going to contest that. Human savagery to humans does not align with dignity. He points out he's not unaware that humans do atrocious things to one another, but he'll make the case that when they do, that is a violation of the other's dignity. So that doesn't get rid of the notion of dignity, nor does it get rid of the notion of human rights. Indeed, in a way, he would point out that we can recognize that it's savagery exactly because of the way that it violates human rights. Carrying on, though, he is aware then that the affirmation of human dignity as a kind of human greatness can lead to a kind of chauvinism, privileging humans in a way that denigrates other species. And that sort of prioritization is no better founded than any other kind of chauvinism. And finally, there is the objection that there's just really nothing all that special about humans. We're just one species among other species. And in that light, there's no reason to prioritize humans for special rights, either that should not also extend to other species, or that we should have them in the first place. Now, by contrast, Kateb holds the idea of dignity as offering something important and necessary in spite of all of these objections. He thinks that humanity, unlike any other species that exists, is partly discontinuous with nature, so that we are partly natural, but partly we escape from nature as well, and that this distinguishes us from all other species, that it's this quality of partial discontinuity with nature that makes us the special kind of species that we are. On this count, there's both species dignity as distinct from other species, so you can take all of humanity as a species and say that set, that group of beings that is human, has a species dignity distinct from all other species. And individual dignity, so then the dignity that each human has that we can hold up relative to one another. And it's this equally held status as human that has a share in this common human dignity. He says then, all individuals are equal. No other species is equal to humanity. So it is our dignity as members of a species with dignity that makes us equal to one another, and it is our dignity as humans that takes us as a species and distinguishes us from all other species. He thinks of this then as the stature of humanity compared to other species and the status of individuals relative to one another. I should be clear, though, that this status, when I say relative to one another, that doesn't imply for Kateb that there's a ranking of individuals relative to one another, but rather that our status as equal to one another on the basis of this shared dignity. The aspect that both of these, status and stature, share is uniqueness defined by partial discontinuity with nature. So again, because all humans share this, all are equal in dignity, and therefore each unique individual has an equal claim against treatment that violates human dignity. That's why it's important to make the case that when he talks about this individual status, it's a status as equals, not a status as ranked, one compared to others. That we have an equal status on the basis of this dignity. So we can imagine other kinds of statuses like socioeconomic status, where you can see that there's a clear ranking. You could rank people in one way by income or by wealth, and you could come up with then a stratified society in which there is a difference in status. That is not the kind of status that Kateb is talking about. He's talking about the status of dignity. It's not a great analogy, but you could think of it as in some ways comparable to saying that all humans have skin. And it's something that is just intrinsic to our humanness in ways that Kant has described. And so you can say that no human is more skin-ish than any other human, because we all have skin in the same way as everyone else. And so then dignity would be the comparable thing that we all have. So then what distinguishes status from stature is how we recognize and define them. We think of status negatively by what compromises it. So the things that violate my human rights are the things that attack my status as a member of the human species. Stature, on the other hand, we think of at this species-wide level then. So we think of it as corresponding to human achievements, what it is that sets humans apart from all other species. Individual dignity or personal identity is vulnerable to two sorts of transgressions. One is when an individual is treated as if she or he is not a human being like every other human being with a common dignity of all other human beings. We saw this with Kant as well. This is the distinction between treating another person like a person versus treating another person like a thing, right? That's one of the ways that he phrases the categorical imperative. Treat people as ends in themselves, never solely as means. So this would be one way that you could see it. Kateb has in mind more egregious violations than simply treating somebody as a means to an end. So he has in mind kinds of, say, torture or psychological treatment and this sort of thing that will undermine someone's humanness, or seek to undermine their humanness, or seek to strip someone's humanness from them as if they can be treated like a thing. So then the second is when a person is treated like just one more undifferentiated member of the species rather than a unique, irreplaceable individual. This again comes back to the distinction that Kant makes between person and thing, because he says that persons cannot be just swapped one for the other. Things can. So again, the idea that another mug would work or cup would work just as well to hold my tea, that implies that one thing can be substituted or exchanged for another. And so when you treat one human as simply replaceable by another anonymous human, as just one member of an undifferentiated species, then you're treating that person like a thing again. Kateb might point out that you could also see this with other kinds of species, where the similarity between them might allow for the substitution of one for another. He doesn't say that explicitly, though, so I don't want to pin too much of that on his claims. Next then, individual status is pivotal for human dignity because it resists ideas of superiority or inferiority in the way that I was saying. So there will be within societies ways of rank ordering individuals. Income would be one, honors would be another. So some people will bear titles, say, in the United Kingdom, and others don't. And that would be a way of rank ordering individuals. So these are possible ways of asserting superiority and inferiority of human beings. Similarly, any kind of organization is going to have people who rank above and others who rank below. This happens, but for Kateb, the important thing is that this doesn't have to do with dignity. This has to do with other kinds of ordering. For human dignity, rather, there is no superior and inferior. There's no, for him, sense of more dignity and less dignity than other human beings. But rather that this is just a thing that people share. He makes then an important argument against identity as group identity. He sees identity as having two levels, individual and species. So one danger is that group rights often do not translate into, but rather abridge, individual rights. Another is that when the individual confuses affiliation for identity, then his or her individualism becomes smothered and ossified. And if you think back just a couple of slides ago, you could see why this would be coherent with what he was, or continuous with what he was arguing just a moment ago. Why? Because if you take your identity as fully one of affiliation, of your membership in a group, then you are in effect saying that you can be replaced by anyone else with that same affiliation, that you can swap one human for another in that case. And then you get into this same problem that he was talking about and that Kant was talking about, of thinking of human beings on the model of things, where one can simply replace another rather than on the individual distinctiveness, as the individual as a bearer of dignity in and of himself or herself, right? And so then if you overvalue affiliation, if you pin all of your identity on affiliation, then you lose that individual share of dignity, or you don't lose it, but you ignore that you have it. And this is why then your individualism and the dignity, the human dignity that corresponds to you as an individual, becomes smothered. To put it back into Kant's terms, you could see this as the application of a heteronymous principle rather than an autonomous principle. You make yourself, or you create your identity under the sway of some other law that you have not created for yourself. He says, affiliation is self-defining and life-defining. Affiliation that is self-defining and life-defining gives a person a hand-me-down identity, an identity that has completion and enclosure, which no personal identity that is free of self-mystification can possibly be. One's life becomes a vicarious experience lived through the fate of the group. So again, this idea that your dignity as an individual member of a species becomes subsumed by your affiliation. Your affiliation becomes your defining feature, not your individuality. So this is the threat then that he sees with this over-identification with the group. Now then, Kateb takes identity to be existential rather than moral. Existential in the sense that we were just talking about, right? That with your individual dignity, that is an existential claim. It's not a moral claim. So, selfhood, autonomy, authenticity, freedom, equality, honor, and so on, these are all existential values according with the individual as a bearer of individual dignity as a member of the species. Okay, so then what does he mean by existential? This is an important it's an important term in the way that he's elaborating his argument. And we get his idea most clearly in the way that he distinguishes it from moral value, existential value versus moral value. The emphasis on individual identity is why he thinks that human dignity is an existential value. Moral values differ, even though they can remain related to existential values. And he does concede toward the end of his elaboration on this that it might simply be impossible to offer a strict separation of the two, as if there's a clear dividing line saying that this is where existential value ends and this is where moral value begins. Nonetheless, he thinks that it's worth distinguishing the two because it helps get conceptually at the work that dignity is doing. He says, I mean that for many people, and rightly, morality has to do solely or principle with human suffering. So again, we should immediately alert to that and say, oh, okay, so when we're talking about suffering, then we should hear the echo of utilitarianism in this, that what makes an act morally reprehensible is the suffering that it imposes on someone. And he'll qualify that later, especially as needless suffering. Anyway, moving on. So morality having to do with human suffering, but human dignity in its concern with status and stature has to do with the proper recognition of the identity of every human being and the identity of the human species. So these are questions of the existence of the human being as such. Being made to suffer bodily and materially is not conceptually the same wrong as being treated as if one is not a human being. Right? So the thing that he's pointing to here is that one person can exercise violence on another person, say, without ever losing sight of the fact that that other person is a human being, and without even implying that that is the case. And so that will involve suffering, and so there will be a moral wrong to it. But he thinks then that that is a qualitatively different thing than wishing to negate or deny the humanness of the person that you're treating in the first place. That is just a qualitatively different kind of wrong. So in the moral existential value distinction, he differs from Kant, right? Kant claims that human dignity or worth lies in the uniquely human capacity to act morally. If you think back to the groundwork, this is what he was saying. So he sees this tight interconnection between human dignity, reason, and morality. Why? Because we are self-legislators who can legislate according to the universal law or the universal or the categorical imperative. Only the good will respects moral law. So we must treat humans as ends, not merely as means, right? So this is Kant's view. To put the two thoughts together, this is Kateb now, we accord persons the respect they deserve as ends when we treat them in a way that shows our respect for the moral law, not when we mimic morality out of one or another emotion or interest, much less when we immorally or disrespectfully use them as mere means. So this sounds very, very close to Kant, doesn't it, right? Again, that if we mimic morality out of some other interest than the will, so emotions, inclinations, that's heteronymous again, right? It's not acting autonomously. It's allowing the will to labor under a law that it has not given itself, but rather has been given to it by some other force, like emotion or interest. So then it would be a mimicry of morality rather than morality full-blown, because morality full-blown will obey dutifully toward the universal law. And again, then, this is what would allow us, this moral mimicry would allow us to treat others as means rather than ends in themselves, which again, that's a violation of the categorical imperative, as Kant has phrased it in one of his phrasings. Kateb finds Kant makes too close an association of the moral and the existential, though, pointing out that free agency does not reduce to moral agency, right? So the ability to act freely, autonomously, does not reduce to the ability to act morally. He thinks that morality is not up to all of the sort of heavy conceptual lifting that human rights require. And that's where dignity comes in, this existential aspect of humanness. He writes, "I am what no one else is, while not existentially superior to anyone else. We human beings belong to a species that is what no other species is. It is the highest species on Earth." Now, again, it's not that he's giving some kind of metric that allows us to rank all different species on like some sort of ladder or something, but rather his reasoning here is that you have all the species of Earth, only one, humans, has this particular quality of being partially beyond nature, partially distinct from nature, or not constrained entirely by nature. So then it's not uniqueness itself that is commendable, but rather the qualities that make up our individual and species uniqueness. That is what's commendable. He says, only the human species is, in the most important existential respects, a break with nature and significantly not natural. So he makes the case in support of this that humans can be, and in a sense must be, stewards of all other species, because we are the only species that has the power to affect virtually every species in existence. And that is what puts us in this role of having to take on the stewardship of other species. And he goes on to point out then that it's not as if, say, humans were about to desert the Earth. It's not as if humans could pass on these principles of how to be good stewards to any other species, even the most closely related to us, like chimpanzees or bonobos, and that they could step into that role. No, his point is that there is no other species that is even a candidate to step into that role. That is what gives humans their distinctiveness. On this basis, then, a central contribution of the concept of human dignity is the sensitivity that it offers to the deprivation of human qualities, this specific set of qualities for humans. Such deprivation is clearest in the case of crimes against humanity, right? These sorts of crimes that individuals or groups of individuals can enact against others that directs itself specifically at the humanity of their victims. That this is something, again, that is unique to humans, that you just can't find this in any other species, because there are no other species that have these kinds of human qualities, that have the kind of dignity that you could attack through a crime against humanity. So then this kind of attack, he thinks, or this kind of deprivation, inflicts a suffering that is greater than just pain. It goes beyond suffering as experiencing pain, because it is suffering as a loss of one's sense of humanness, or at very least, the deprivation is aimed at undermining one's sense of humanness. He goes on then to distinguish two sorts of values for human rights. They have an instrumental value on the moral plane, which is about reducing suffering, right? That human rights seek to keep states in particular from imposing undue suffering on their citizenry. So that makes room for the just application of laws. That's going to involve suffering, but it's not going to be undue suffering. It's going to be suffering connected to the violation of law. Though again, he'll acknowledge some laws are designed specifically to impose undue suffering. They won't accord with the notion of justice that Kant outlined at the beginning. In any case, though, this is, in Kateb's view, an instrumental value, one that happens just on the moral plane. Secondly, they have to bring back that term that I introduced with Kant, they have a deontological, existential value in compelling the recognition of the individual's status as a unique identity that shares in human dignity as an individual, right? So you'll remember then deontology has to do with morals constructed around the sense of duty that Kant was outlining. Morals that are defined in the light of the universal law. This is what allows Kateb to claim, quote, "The infliction of needless suffering on any person is wrong not only for the pain that it causes, moral suffering, but also for the failure to recognize a shared humanity that it demonstrates, existential." So then what point is he making about the idea of human stewardship of other species? This again, I mentioned it before, this gets back to the notion of humans as escaping nature to some extent. Not fully, we're not completely unnatural, but that we are significantly not natural in his view. And that it's this escape from nature, Kant would say that it has to do with our possession of, and in a sense our possession by reason. That there's a sense both in which we cannot help but reason, not that we're always reasonable all the time, but that we can't help but reason, say, when we find ourselves in disagreement with someone and we want to persuade that person of our point of view. We can't help but try to provide reasons and organize them in a way that is coherent, that will be undeniably persuasive to the other person. In a way, we can't stop ourselves from doing that, even though we also are entirely capable of doing that same kind of thing and allowing ourselves to be, allowing our reason to be overrun by other impulses, to be heteronomously defined, you could say. So then, it's this kind of thing then that for Kateb allows the human distinctiveness, the stature of humans in comparison to all other species, and the individual distinctiveness as the individual bearer of this dignity that corresponds with the species as a whole. That this kind of dignity is for him what grounds human rights, and why the notion of dignity in fact is not peripheral to human rights, not something that a theory of human rights can take or leave, but rather is, in a sense, the pin around which human rights rotates as such. That without this notion of dignity, you can't get the coherent argument for human rights. You can't get a coherent defense of human rights. It falls apart. So then that is that brings us to the end of his thinking on dignity. Next week, we turn to John Stuart Mill on freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. Thank you.